The following is a conversation with historian Dr. Diana Wylie. As Hegel observed, we learn from history that we do not learn from history. Now, I used to nod along with that bleak aphorism, but this discussion with Dr. Wylie has been a sort of mental reset. It's made me realize that our history is not just a collection of dates and events, but it's to be felt, to be lived, to be understood in a way that transcends academic scholarship. It's about engaging with the messy and frankly sometimes bewildering adventure that is human experience. Now, throughout our conversation, you will hear us delving into topics like Operation Torch, which Dr. Wylie is currently working on. She brings up topics or ideas like spies and espionage. However, it's very important to remember that we're talking about events from 80 years ago during World War II, a period that shaped but is very distinct from the present. This is a time when Morocco was under Spanish and French protectorates. This context helps us appreciate the layers of history and the stories that emerge from it. Dr. Wylie's work beautifully bridges academic brilliance with profound empathy and a deep understanding of the human condition. I hope you enjoy this talk as much as I did. We were talking before about your Fulbright experience and how many times you came here. I think you told me about the first time. That was Casablanca, right? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, my first Fulbright was in 2013 to 14 in Casablanca when I worked for Casa Mémoire, a wonderful group of local people interested in preserving the architectural beauty of that underappreciated city. It's wonderful to go to Casablanca and not to have to deal with a lot of tourists because they don't think Casablanca is noteworthy, whereas it is noteworthy. It's a beautiful city.
Yeah.
So my job as a volunteer, I became a guide to the Medina during the Journée du Patrimoine in Casablanca, was to learn about the city's history and to be able to talk about it by referring to the buildings in the city. That is not just in the Medina, but also in the Place des Nations Unies and where the now Wylie is located and the Parc de la Ligue Arabe and all those wonderful neighborhoods that have really stunning architecture.
Nice. And then the second experience was 2022?
Yes, and the first half of 2022, I was teaching at the École d'Architecture de Casablanca in Ain Sabah, and I had something like 30 students who were all architecture students. I taught a course to them that I taught to students at Boston University called Vivre dans la ville, or Living in the City, and it took the students from Sumeria to Shanghai by effectively telling the stories of how those cities grew and why and what the impact on people over the course of the entire human history, the history of human civilization.
Well, actually, I was fascinated when I saw the trailer for your course. I was looking you up and I saw the trailer on YouTube, and you talked about what the course is covering and everything, and I thought I wish I was able to take that course because it's always wonderful when you find a historian who can actually tell you that I am going to teach you something about the whole history of humanity. And I'm talking about something as interesting as cities. I'm not just, because usually with historians, this is one thing that they are different from, or at least somewhat different from literary scholars, is that you have to focus on a specific period of time, not just to travel all around and everything. So it is interesting when you cover a lot of things. So right now you're affiliated with the Boston University, right? All I know about Boston is what Scorsese and Ben Affleck and those people did, the accent, and that it's a close-knit society or community, and that there are a lot of churches there.
Yeah.
Is it true? Are the cliches about Boston true? Mainly, I'm sorry to keep interrupting you, but I want you to talk to me as an American talking to a Moroccan who's only been exposed to Boston through Hollywood.
Okay. Well, just as Hollywood didn't actually reflect Casablanca in the film Casablanca, there is not a lot of truth maybe in some of those movies, but there is also some, because it is a city that has been the home to very powerful mafias, the Irish and the Italian mafias. And by the way, I've just learned recently that the unit of the FBI charged with investigating those mafias is closing down.
Oh, wow.
Because I think they're too old. The mafiosi are too old now, and crime has taken other forms. So that's one face that Scorsese and others publicized. There's also the Irish face of Boston.
True. They also publicized that, to be fair.
Yes,
yeah.
Which is interesting because the Kennedys brought it to a high level of public consciousness, I guess. But through novels, and we may want to talk about fiction at one point.
Yeah, absolutely.
One can get a sense of the complexity of the Irish history in Boston that is very exciting to learn about. I'm thinking of Dennis Lehane, for example, a wonderful Boston crime writer who has written books about Boston's history, and particularly the Irish aspect of Boston's history, that are not sentimental, but that are very, very clear about bigotry, prejudice, violence, in a city that is also hyper-civilized, with wonderful universities, many hospitals, and medical research companies and pharmaceutical companies. So it has many different phases and faces, temporal phases and ugly and beautiful phases.
Amazing. Besides your work in Casablanca, there is what you did in Tangier, which yielded Enchantment in 2010, which I know now that you're updating. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, when I came here in 2007 on sabbatical, I had just finished a biography of a South African artist. My training is as a South Africanist historian. I arrived and was invited within hours of landing by the director of this museum, Tor Cunningham, to write a book about the art in the collection. I said yes immediately, and 3 years later, Enchantment was born. It was my attempt to tell stories, important stories about Moroccan history through the art in this museum. And I have to say that researching it and writing it was one of the happiest experiences of my life, because I was able to rely on an art collection that has many, many interesting stories embedded in it. And I would invite any listener to come to the museum in order to start experiencing those stories, which I hope I have facilitated by writing many of the texts that are on the wall, the legends underneath the paintings, but also laminated sheets that people can pick up if they want to go into deeper and deeper levels or layers of understanding of Moroccan history.
I understand that now that since it's been 15 years since the publication of the book, you're working on updating it, which means right now, as I'd like to call you the expert on the topic, you're still exploring or discovering new things that happened here, or new discoverable archives and stuff that maybe you didn't cover in the 2010 version.
Well, the Enchantment has sold out twice, so it does need to be reissued. But there have been so many changes over the years to the museum, to the exhibits in the museum, that the time was ripe to, let's say, write about Operation Torch. There's a whole room dedicated to that operation, which was the Allied landings in November of 1942 that hastened the end of the Second World War. Someone has also given 3 beautiful brass engravings by a 17th century Czech, Bohemian engraver named Wenceslas Haller that are here in the museum. He was sent out in 1668, I believe, to make images of this city so that the King of England, Charles II, could understand what the place he had gained as part of the dowry of his Portuguese bride actually looked like. So when you go into a particular room here in the museum, you begin to see Tangier through 17th century eyes. I could go on, but those are just examples of new acquisitions.
Yeah, that's amazing. To take you back to Operation Torch, does that have anything to do with what you told me before about the spies and like the...
Completely.
Right?
Yes.
You told me about a specific figure, someone from Massachusetts, your hometown. Can you...
Well, there were actually 2 men from the Boston area, Gordon Brown and Carlton Kuhn, who came here to be spies and discover if there were an Allied invasion, where the Spanish gun emplacements were that they would have to avoid, where the mines in the harbors were that would blow up any invading ships. They had to win local allies. And what I find really interesting is that these 2 men, both of whom had lived in the Reef in the 1920s, doing anthropological research, their task was to make contact with local people, and they had 2 excellent informants who they trusted and who, according to them, gave them a lot of valuable information. One was the head of the Durkawa Brotherhood, and the other one was Abdul Karim's general. And Carlton Kuhn wrote a book in which he mentions them, but not by name. He mentions them by their pseudonyms, Strings and Tassels. But in what I'm now writing, I'm going to use their real names and actually use a photograph of one of them, because these were anti-Spanish Moroccans, not yet nationalists. They were more Rifi in their oriented toward the particular Zawiya of the Durkawa. Then they were dreaming of an independent Morocco. But those men would tell their followers, you need to bring me all the information that you can about where the guns are, where the troops are. And those 2 men also brought sacks of weapons from Gibraltar to Tangier, and in the diplomatic pouch, like Sten guns, that's British automatic submachine guns, 45 pistols, flares, grenades. They brought them when this area was Spanish, and it was bordering the Vichy collaborators with the fascists. So it was dangerous to be hauling this weaponry around. But Tangier was a transit point for those weapons between Gibraltar and Casablanca, where they would be used to allow the invading allies to come ashore safely, and they did.
Wow. To go back to one little fact you mentioned there, and I wanted to ask you how you came about finding that out as a historian. You said in his book, he only used their code names or nicknames, but how did you find out that these are the people he's talking about, since the code names are entirely
I'm glad
American?
you asked me that, because there was a box of the papers of Gordon Brown given to the legation and put in storage. And only recently, and by recently I mean within the last few days, as far as I can tell, has anyone been looking at and organizing those papers so that you have the actual reports that Gordon Brown wrote to the head of the OSS, a man called Wild Bill Donovan, explaining what Abdus Sadek, the head of the Durkawa, was doing for him. Because these men, by the way, they didn't have to do this, but they figured, they didn't know that the Spanish wouldn't invade. They didn't know that the Germans wouldn't invade. Therefore, one of the things they were doing was making alliances with Rifi groups to riot and rise up in order to protect American paratroopers if they landed, and in order to prevent the Germans and the Spanish from repulsing the Allied invaders. So, we really are in a major theater of risk in November of 1942, precisely where we're sitting, because the offices down there were all offices inhabited by men who looked to be vice consuls, that is State Department employees, but they were actually military attachés, and two of them were spies, that is Kuhn and Brown, the two Bostonians.
Wow. And so to their minds, these people from the Reef, these two men, to their minds, you said they weren't, it's not yet their nationalistic or nationalist identity hasn't completely formed yet, let's say, but to their minds, helping the Americans is a form of resistance against the Spanish and the Germans, right?
Well, I don't want to pretend they weren't paid.
Okay,
they were doing it for money in part,
okay.
But they weren't. They weren't happy with, according to Carlton Kuhn, they were particularly unhappy with what they saw as the French blocking the educational advancement of Moroccans. I'm not saying they were right, but that was an aspect of the ideology of the Rifi leaders, the Moroccan nationalists of the time like Balafrej, and also the attitudes of Brown and Kuhn, because those were the Moroccans who they had communication with.
Wow, wow. Okay, moving on to an entirely or slightly different topic. When you came to Tetouan, you talked about writing, the relationship between writing and thinking, and how those are part and parcel of revisiting history. I want to add to that equation reading, and I want to ask you about your opinion or perspective on what's happening right now with our attention span, with this generation's attention span, as opposed to the rigorous training that an academic has that allows them to spend many hours, continuous hours in a room alone with a book or with articles, etc. And I know we talked about this in the green room, but so I am not very optimistic about this, although I should be, but I don't see it getting any better, this generation's attention span, or this generation's appreciation for reading, and after that, writing, which means basically thinking. So how do you see the future playing out when it comes to this, a specific problem, let's say?
Well, I don't want to say I'm pessimistic.
Okay.
It worries me that you seem to be pessimistic yourself.
Yes. It worries me too, but I can't do anything about it.
But the joy of losing oneself in a book is deeper and longer term than whatever spark of interest you get by flicking your forefinger across the screen of a device.
Okay.
And I don't think people are going to lose that desire to go deeper, to understand more richly. There's something deeply superficial and ultimately unsatisfying about the flicker of a thought, as opposed to being engrossed in it and rereading, for example, a text and discovering that each time you read it, You see the world a little bit more richly. So yes, there are risks, but we're living in a time with a lot of risks. That happens to be one of them. I guess the only hopeful thing, or one of the most hopeful things we can say, is people do seem to be aware of fake news, of doctored images, of AI-generated texts. I mean, human nature won't have changed.
True. So don't you think that being aware of something doesn't mean you're immune to it? To the extent that people are openly talking about how addictive social media is and the scrolling and all of that, and how susceptible a lot of people are to fake news, unfortunately. But a lot of people are self-conscious, a lot of people are self-aware, but at the same time, they're talking about it as if it's cigarettes. Well, maybe someday I'll quit, but for now, I'm a mindless consumer. Well, it's unfortunate. So you could see my pessimism taking hold.
Well, let me just add that I think maybe this is a good challenge for those of us who are interested in history to try not to stop writing, but to learn new ways of communicating about the past. I mean, maybe people are less likely to read a laminated sheet than they are to listen to, well, a podcast or an audio guide. Maybe the text should be made available to the ear and not just to the eye. Maybe, as I mentioned earlier, when you're in a classroom and you've been told that you're no longer Jawad, you have become Robespierre, and your job is to fight for the French Revolution. And you become someone, an actor, a historical actor. And then, in the second half of the course that I taught on revolution, using the French Revolution and the Algerian Revolution, in the second half of the course you might become Ben Bella, and you have to interact with your fellow students, not as Jawad, but as someone with certain interests, with certain constraints, and then your knowledge of the past deepens. It's not the lecture mode. Maybe we just have to continue being creative about how we communicate.
True. So it's not necessarily the act of reading in and of itself. As historians, we need to get with the times in the sense that change the mediums, or at least adopt to the media that we have now. And your perfect example of shedding one's identity, or at least pausing it and immersing yourself in another one, is another act of doing exactly that, right? Live in history, not just reading it. Or this idea of or this human tendency to escape, to distract yourself, to find the ultimate entertainment. I'll give you the example we talked about before of the movie or the book Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, in which he depicts this movie that someone created that's so entertaining that if anyone watches it is suddenly unable to watch or enjoy anything else until they eventually die. And this is used as a weapon, which is exactly what we were talking about. Do you think history is also a form of escapism, going back in history, retracing our steps?
Well, I suppose romantic historical novels are a form of escapism.
True.
There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, people do need to escape. It's not bad. But
it's unfortunate that we don't learn from it, though.
Well, you may learn something that's just a fantasy. But fantasies are okay. It's just claiming that it was true that is the problem.
Yeah.
And yet, as we said earlier, there's something to be gained from reading fiction, insights into the emotional reality of living in another time, for example, the personal dilemmas that arouse for historical actors. We should know them and not just the state version of policy, which is the kind of document you tend to find in official archives. So when you asked me earlier about fiction, I'm not opposed to people using fiction, critically of course, as a way of transcending our rootedness in the moment, stimulating our imaginations.
True. Even as a historian, even while doing research, You need to look into fiction. And I asked you before, how can you reconcile that with the historical method of making sure you've got the right archives, and this is not just someone's musings about something? I'm using this just to shed light. So you said in your writing you would say, well, perhaps, or this is what allegedly, or etc.
Well, I think there's a case-by-case sensitivity that one has to have. Sometimes you have hit gold because of the way something is written, because of who's writing it, in what circumstances. And at other times, as you say, it's relatively trivial.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't think that musing is always trivial, because it's the product of someone living in a moment where we are not now. And we can learn. We can learn from musings.
Still, you can still learn. Yeah. Okay. Well, this brings me to the idea that boggles my mind. It's that literary scholars and historians and in literature, you can study things and you have the benefit of the doubt, or you have more leeway of because you're just criticizing a work of fiction. But as a historian, if you say that someone said something, or that someone thought a certain thought, you will need to be able to back that up. Is this something that you think is a hindrance for historians, or is it part of your training? It's something that you have to be able to do.
To look at the same problem from multiple angles, it's crucial.
Okay.
Because the most boring work is work that has not been written in response to an open question.
Sure.
That if you set out wanting, let's say, to glorify an ancestor,
it's basically
it's
historical
nice for
propaganda.
the family. It's nice
exactly,
for the family.
Exactly. Yeah. But other than that,
Right.
what do you bring into the
Yeah.
table? Yeah. True. My next question is about, still in academia. What do you think about the phrase "publish" or "perish" as it relates to teaching? I know as academics, people are given jobs, given overnight tenure based on their publishing career mainly. But do you think that has something to do directly with your ability to teach? Because I truly believe that they're entirely different things, to publish and to teach. And the latter is much more difficult, I believe. What do you think about that?
well, writing is hard.
Absolutely, yes.
And writing about complex things simply is extremely hard. There's nothing harder.
Yes.
Furthermore, as I said in Tetuan a few weeks ago, I do believe that writing is thinking.
Yes.
That it sounds, I don't get upset over publish or perish.
Okay.
Because people can get away with sloppy thinking if they don't write. With telling a charming anecdote that nobody has questioned them about and that they have not questioned themselves about. So people, I think academics have to write in order to come to terms with what they actually know and what they don't know. Because writing forces you into that encounter with your own ignorance.
Especially writing to publish, which means
for another audience.
You know that there's peer review and there's an audience that's going to read this. So you need to make sure what you're saying is.
Yes.
So it's not just thinking. It's not just you sounding nice and enamoring people, but it's actual thinking and actual work and research. But as an instructor, or as a teacher, or as someone who wants to facilitate information or allow people access to certain historical corners, do you think it's just enough to do research to be able to do that, or you have to publish? And by research, I mean doing research, but I think to you, doing research, part and parcel of it is publishing, right? Is that what you basically? Okay. So, to be a successful teacher, you need to be a successful writer. And the metric for measuring that is publishing.
Yeah, because when you're teaching, you are trying to interest the reader in something they don't know about. And you're trying to lead them through your thought process and the evidence and leave them with an idea, with a possible answer. That's what you do in a classroom as well. You write an introduction, you speak an introduction, you go through the body of what you have to say, and then you sum up, and then you give them an exam.
Nice, okay, that makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
Okay, do you think, after your long career of teaching, do you think, or do you believe that the cliche turns out to be true, and the teacher learns a lot more than the student does?
You know, sometimes when students tell me what they have appreciated, I'm surprised because it isn't exactly what I thought
Or what
I
you
was
intended.
aiming for.
Yeah.
But that's fine. I mean, it's, especially in the humanities, what you're trying to do is open people's minds to a variety of perspectives, to different eras in history, to basically leaving the limits of their own experience. And that is valuable, I think, on a personal level, because as I said in Tetuan, I think one of the attributes of doing history is your sense of empathy for others grows. And secondly, I think doing history ideally will make you a better citizen. Why is that? Because if you realize how complicated it is to achieve something, let's say, like the Allied invasion of 1942, and you see how easily things could have gone wrong, in a sense it can empower you into realizing that there are always points of leverage where you as a citizen, as a person in time and place, can actually influence events. You're not subject to power, pure and simple. You have power you can exert, and learning history should empower people or give them a sense of their potential power.
True. In other words, when you're inside of it, you can't see it, but studying history allows you to get outside and
Ideally,
see, right?
ideally, yes.
Amazing. My question now is about I have this thing about Moroccan academia, and I have a feeling that, especially in literary scholarship, I have a feeling that we have or we dove too deep in the post-colonial Orientalist, or in other words, or from another perspective, gender studies approaches. To the extent that a lot of new scholars, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with these, they're amazing and groundbreaking in many contexts, but to the extent that new scholars now, most of them only see these approaches. They only know to do this. It's almost like tunnel vision. It's either Orientalism, post-colonialism, or gender studies. Do you have any advice on how to at least make those fields nuanced or introduce new things to them, not just be stuck in them and regurgitating the same arguments over and over again?
Jawad, I think that's such a smart question, and I'm really glad you asked it.
Thank you.
Because you are speaking to someone who isn't that fond of theoretical fashion,
Okay.
because I think it clouds the insights to be gained, and it also reduces them to simplistic messages that are fashionable.
I heartily agree. Yeah,
that
absolutely.
are simply
It's the
fashionable.
trend. It's the new trend. Yeah.
And it also sometimes seems like sheer careerism. I'll say that in order to be hired for a certain job.
Exactly.
I mean, to give you an example, you mentioned Orientalism. Obviously, Edward Said was a great academic, and
Yes.
his book was extremely influential. But it is not the last word on the encounter between the East and the West.
Absolutely.
It was quite appropriate for the time when he wrote it, and he opened people's minds and changed minds. But it doesn't mean that, I believe, that understanding Orientalism as an exercise in dominance, in reducing a colonized people to an easily conceived of group, is the last word on that encounter. And what I try to do in the book Enchantment, without mentioning Said, who once again I truly respected a great deal, is that there was a lot more going on. There was an exchange of technique, there was an exchange of points of view, there was mutual appreciation, hence the title Enchantment. And I use the word métissage, or mixture, to try to communicate that when Rabati, for example, whose paintings I'm pointing at now, was the cook for John Lavery, a British Society portrait painter, Rabati looked at what John Lavery was doing and he liked the paint. And he started painting himself, but he painted from his own point of view. And he painted, I think, humorously and cleverly, totally unlike John Lavery. But it was a fertile interchange. It wasn't an act pure and simple of domination.
Exactly.
So this is one of the good things that I think the visual can bring home to people.
Yeah, absolutely.
You see actual physical evidence of mutual fascination.
And evidence of the nuance of the whole thing. Because
Excellent word, excellent word.
So it's not just a Moroccan thing, it's a trend that's prevalent in academia nowadays, because...
But you know, I have to say, I think the people who slavishly follow a fashion or trend are not going to be as successful in the job market as those who actually talk to you and interest you in a new way of looking at things.
And not necessarily even, you don't even have to have something to offer as a new way of looking at things. You will, as a new school of thought or whatever, but just even if you ask new questions or ask different questions that are not necessarily within that specific paradigm, that would be that's a good thing. That's what academia is all about, I would say. Yeah. My next question is, it's not really a question, it's just this, I want you to comment on a common phrase. Not every reader is your mom. What do you think about that? Especially if you can gear it towards new scholars such as myself and people who are opting to write better and publish, etc.
Okay, well, I would interpret what you just said as being, if you are hypersensitive to criticism, you're not going to grow much or fast. To be a creative person in the world, one needs to accept criticism. There is nothing more important than someone saying to you, I don't understand what you were saying, or I didn't like that particular word, why did you use it? Or is this argument really accurate? I mean, those are well-meaning questions. They are not hostile, vicious, undermining questions. I think the worst thing is when academics or anybody on the planet closes down and closes up when criticized. Now, Mom may not criticize you very much because she loves you and she wants to build your self-confidence. We need that too.
So, how do you suggest we find this balance between, for lack of a better word, good self-consciousness and bad self-consciousness, in the sense that good self-consciousness is being open to criticism, understanding that people are not there to hurt you but to give you advice and help you, and on the other hand not to close off completely and say my writing is not worth reading and I'm just this is not even good for anyone to see. As instructors or as professors, how can someone instill a sense of humility while writing and at the same time a sense of confidence that what you're writing is worth reading?
You know, when we write, yes, it's coming out of our reading and our thinking and our feelings, but it's not essentially about us, it's about that. I'm writing about Operation Torch right now. How can I do justice to Operation Torch, which has nothing to do with me, even though my father was a soldier in the Second World War, so I have some kind of
Personal
curiosity. Curiosity. Of course, it happened before I was born, so I'd never lived through it. But I think to know about what's outside of us is the whole point. And one thing that I say to myself and others now is at this point in my life, what I want to know more than anything else is how things really work. Not how the authorities tell us they are working but are not. Not how they should be working, but what is actually leading to the status quo that we're grappling with. And that is a gargantuan task to answer that question. And it's not about us. We are just the thinking tool trying to answer that question.
True. And I think that's how we do justice to the humanities in general, because there's no one else to actually, once you think about it, it is an important job for humanity.
Yes.
And, well, as we know, not a lot of importance is given to humanities, but they are the only people who are capable of doing this job.
I know people are in need of gainful employment, and that tech will give them that, medicine, law. But we also need to cultivate our souls, our spirits, our minds, our imagination, our capacity to be lyrical. We can't give that up, or we become robots.
Exactly.
I don't think we ever will.
Exactly. I think Saul Bellow is someone who said when he won the Nobel Prize, he told them that, well, that was my response to anyone who thinks literature or in general the humanities are not that important, because he said when the sun sets on humanity, we would be the ones decorating or painting on the crib inside for everyone, right?
Yeah.
At the end of every episode, I like to ask two questions. One of them is, have you read or watched or seen anything recently that deeply impacted you and you would like to recommend to our listeners and people watching? Anything at all recently, or anything that's like your favorite book, any podcast, an article, anything that you would like to recommend?
Oh, what a nice question to end on.
There's still one more.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Well, I spent the first half of 2024 reading as if I were hungry for books. And I read so many wonderful books that I regret having to choose only one.
Okay, no, you'll have to give us three. I'll give you three.
No. I highly recommend an Irish short story writer named Claire Keegan.
Claire Keegan.
Whose stories are amazing. She writes lyrically, but in the easy style, as if it were pure speech.
Amazing.
Of Irish cadence. And she's writing about a historical problem, which is to say the abuse of girls by nuns in a laundry in Ireland. You may have read about it in the press. And what she conveys in this not very long short story is such a wide range of human experience, charity, suffering, cruelty, in historical context.
Wow.
Because this is going on in a village in which the church is hand and glove in harmony with the established power structure in the village. And she never preaches. She never wags her finger. She just shows with this rich, simple prose a huge dilemma in Irish history that people are only now coming to terms with. It's not her only great story, there are many, but I do highly recommend her.
Absolutely, and thank you so much. And I think that's definitely what all fiction should be. no finger wagging, just write and make people question everything and ask questions. And my last question is a bit of a bromide, but I nonetheless think it's important. What does happiness mean to you?
Well, of course, there are multiple answers to that question, but to keep it at the theme, along the theme of today's discussion, there's something about the joy of discovery, the joy of being engaged with a question and with material that will help you answer it, that I find not just happy making, but actually thrilling. Mm-hmm. I find it thrilling to leave my circumstances and to begin to understand the world outside of my circumstances, though albeit connected to them.
Yeah.
So obviously you've set me up to give that answer because of the conversation that we had prior.
But
I think there is it is a truly joyful and thrilling experience to engage with a life we haven't led.
Yeah, put yourself in other people's shoes, etc.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Wylie, thank you so much for
It was a
accepting my
pleasure
invitation.
speaking with you, Jawad.
Thank you so much.